Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. So we are just going to let some more folks trickle in um, as it's just turned 7 o'clock this evening. Just give it about one more minute. Then we'll get into the swing of things. All right, so we will go ahead and begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Gata. I am the Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And welcome back to another virtual parlor chat in our Connect260 virtual parlor chat series. So this session in August is sort of under the theme of the city grows and the house expands. And we have a really great chat for you tonight. But before we turn it over to Matthew, who's waiting in the virtual wings for us, I will give a little bit of a spiel about the mansion, and just sort of let the folks who may be joining us for the very first time know a little bit about our 260 years of history. So like I mentioned, it is the mansion's 260th anniversary. It was built in 1765 and is the oldest remaining house in Manhattan. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, designated an individual landmark in 1967, and an interior landmark in 1975 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. It is built on the ancestral land of the Lenape people, and was likely built and funded using enslaved labor. It was also used as Washington's headquarters in the fall of 1776. While he was there, he got sort of the first semi-win at the Battle of Harlem Heights. But then in the later years, after the Revolution and after our period as a tavern, the mansion housed Eliza Jemel, who is a very prolific businesswoman of the 19th century. Former Vice President Aaron Burr, her second husband, and Anne Northup, who was the wife of Solomon Northup, who wrote his experiences about being kidnapped and taken into slavery in the South in 12 Years a Slave. And so many more of sort of the who's who of history. It keeps going on, but to digress a bit, not keep you here talking about all the fun mansion history, we'll sort of wrap up with something that lands us firmly in this time period. And that is that the Morris-Jumel Mansion became a museum in 1904. So we've got over 100 years of time spent as a museum preserving the stories, first of George Washington, then sort of a broader narrative. And we're very excited to have you here celebrating the 260th year of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. So just some housekeeping updates to share with you about some of our programming that's upcoming. On August 23rd and 24th, so this weekend, we have our 33rd annual Jazz at the Mansion. Marjorie Elliott and Parlor Entertainment come on over from across the street at 555 each year, and bring sort of her wonderful, unique jazz parlor salons into the park. We make it a really unique concert venue all together, and it's really a wonderful experience. So if you're free and you're looking for something free to do this weekend, stop on by. The mansion is also free from 2 to 4 p.m. On our jazz weekends, which is really a great chance to stop on in. Then on September 6th, this isn't run directly through the mansion, but through the Historic House Trust of New York City, we have the Heritage Trail Shuttle Tour, which will cover this year Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. So this is a really great time if you've kind of had on your bucket list to hit Morris-Jumel, Dyckman, Van Cortlandt, all those sort of big manor homes and historic houses in our area and in the Bronx. This is a great time to do it. And I would definitely look into that. I know on their social medias, you can find their link to register for the shuttle tour. Then on September 13th, we have another Family and Community Day, which will be a read-along of Cesaria Feels the Beat, and then making carnival masks as the craft portion of it. Then on September 17th, we have another Connect260, which is going to be focusing on the evolving American dream and the Harlem Renaissance in the neighborhood surrounding the Morris-Jumel Mansion, and sort of a view of the Harlem Renaissance from MJM's windows if you visited the museum during that period. And then on September 18th, we have the Morris-Jumel Mansion's George Washington Dinner and 260th anniversary celebration, which promises to be a wonderful and really lovely night celebrating our rich history and supporting a very wonderful cause. And then on September 27th and 28th, make sure you stop by the MJM table at RevFest 250 in Croton Point Park. If you want to make the trek up to Westchester County, or if you're a Westchester County native, you can head on up there. It promises to be a really wonderful day, so make sure you check that out. Tons of other historic houses and sites there as well, who will be tabling, and reenactors, sort of really cool stuff going on. So, like I mentioned, tickets are now on sale for the George Washington Dinner and 260th anniversary celebration. So come on down. It is going to be September 18th this year. Unlike other years with the George Washington Dinner, it's going to be off-site at the Shabazz Center, so still in the neighborhood, and it's a very historic venue. And it's going to be a really wonderful night. So I highly encourage you to head to our website, check out tickets for that, and hope to see you there. But without further ado, how are we going to submit questions for the Q&A portion tonight? If you look on your screen, there is an option for you to utilize the Q&A function. So please do that throughout the talk. I'll be monitoring it. And then after the lecture that Matthew's going to give, I'll pop back onto the screen and I will serve as your voice to get all those questions that you might have answers. So as soon as you have one pop into your head, go ahead and write it down, submit it. Don't be shy. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Spady. And I will go ahead and read a little bit about him and then turn the invisible microphone on over to him. So Matthew Spady is an independent historian, author, and preservation advocate whose work bridges scholarship, storytelling, and civic engagement. He is best known for his book, The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, Audubon Park and the Families Who Shaped It, a richly researched narrative that brings to life the Audubon Park neighborhood's transition from woodland to cityscape. As director of the Audubon Park Alliance, Spady has participated in successful efforts to secure the neighborhood's designation as a New York City Historic District and its listing on the National Register of Historic Places, ensuring its architectural and cultural legacy is recognized and protected. His research and advocacy have helped illuminate the forgotten histories of New York City's uptown communities, blending archival depth with a passion for place. Spady's academic background includes degrees in English and vocal performance, as well as an artist diploma in opera. After a 2-decade career as a professional performer, he turned to the corporate world, where he spent more than 3 decades working in market research. His interdisciplinary approach draws upon music, literature, architecture, and urban geography to explore how neighborhoods evolve and how memory is preserved. His work has been featured in major news publications, academic journals, community forums, and preservation networks. And so it is my pleasure to hand the floor over to Matthew. So it is all yours.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And just a second, let me get this presentation up. And I believe it is now on the screen. And Danielle, would you let me know if I have the right one there, not the one with my notes, but the one with the slides?
Yes, that is the one with the slides.
Excellent. Then let's get going. Thanks everyone who joined us tonight for this Parlor Chat. I'm delighted to be here. Glad you're here too. Previous Parlor Chats in the Connect260 series have focused on the Morris-Jumel's biography between its construction in the 1760s and its ownership in the last decades of the 19th century. Tonight, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit to the 1890s and then pick up the story around 1900 and carry it forward to 1920. So first, for anyone who may not have ever visited the mansion, let's establish where it is. On the left, you see a map of Manhattan, and moving up the island past the Empire State Building and Central Park through Harlem into Washington Heights, you come to the Jumel Mansion, which is just about where I just clicked on the screen. And on the right, you have a close-up of Roger Morris Park surrounding the mansion. It's just about 2 acres. Around that area, you can see the cityscape comprising row houses from the late 19th century and apartment buildings from the early 20th. We'll look more closely at that development later. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were transformative for northern Manhattan, including those blocks around the mansion we just looked at. At the end of the 19th century, northern Manhattan was still a mixture of small farms, hamlets like Carmensville, suburban enclaves like Audubon Park, and the remnants of large estates like the one Eliza Jumel had owned. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, large parts of northern Manhattan, and particularly the southern part around the mansion, had evolved into an urban streetscape. Multiple factors propelled the city forward, but there were 2 main agents for change that stand out. One was the coming of rapid transit, which opened the area to rapid population growth, and the other was the introduction of new building forms, such as row houses and particularly apartment buildings, which provided housing for those new arrivals and dramatically changed the streetscape. If we'd been living at the mansion during those years, or perhaps visiting it when it first became a museum, these changes would have been clearly visible from the front porch or looking out any of the windows. And let's not forget, change was occurring inside as well, because this was the period when the mansion transitioned from a private residence to a public museum. So that we have a little point of comparison, let's go back a bit, get a sense of what the mansion looked like, what the neighborhood looked like in the 1890s, just as this urban transformation was gaining steam. Now, here's a representation of the mansion in 1893. That came from, it was featured in the June 17th, 1893 edition of the American Architect and Building News periodical. The issue doesn't actually have any commentary, no article about the mansion. This was just an extra image that was included. But interestingly, the caption there refers to it as the old Roger Morris Mansion, with no mention of the Jumels and no mention of George Washington and the American Revolution. Although the mansion sat in isolation on its large plot of land that stretched down to 159th Street and up to 164th, the adjacent blocks were already filling up in the 1890s with residences and some businesses. At the lower right, you can see the northern part of Carmensville. That was a village established in the mid-1840s. And on the lower right is suburban Audubon Park, which evolved from the Audubon's Farm Minis land in the early 1850s. Notice, though, that in 1893, quite a bit of building had already taken place on both sides of 10th Avenue. That's today's Amsterdam Avenue. Also notice that in that large tract of land between Broadway, which was then called the Boulevard, and Amsterdam, even though all of that was still undeveloped, it was lotted and ready for construction, including the land there around the Jumel estate. Now here's a close-up of that map showing the mansion, and to the west, the wooden houses lining the 1-block-long Sylvan Place, which is now called Sylvan Terrace. Those houses date to 1882. The architect was Gilbert Robinson Jr. He built the houses for developer James E. Ray. Their original purpose was to house middle-class residents. Sometimes people think that they were the slave quarters for the Jumel Mansion, but they were not. They were not built until 1882, and they were intended to be rented out to middle-class residents. The roadway between them marks the original approach to the mansion from Kingsbridge Road, which is now St. Nicholas Avenue. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, along 10th Avenue and St. Nicholas, there was quite a bit of development already taking place when this map was made in the 1890s. So now look over there on the right-hand side of the mansion, you see the word aqueduct. Let's take a look at the Croton Aqueduct and see how that passed the mansion and its importance. It was a safe and a reliable water source. That is essential for urbanization, and it was essential for the urbanization that took place in Manhattan in the 19th and 20th centuries. Beginning in 1841, water flowed through the Croton Aqueduct, which crossed the Harlem River there via the High Bridge, which was built slightly later. It was clearly visible if you looked northeast from the mansion. Besides functioning as an aqueduct, the High Bridge also became a very popular tourist destination. This image is showing, as a matter of fact, people who were intended to be tourists there visiting and looking at High Bridge, which was considered pretty much a marvel, bringing water into Manhattan. Ironically, while eminent domain compelled many of the people along the route to cede their land for the aqueduct, those people in Washington Heights didn't actually have access to water from the Croton Aqueduct until after the Civil War. So that was a good 25 years later. That access to city water, though, as I mentioned earlier, it replaced private springs and wells and was another factor that enabled northern Manhattan's urbanization in the early 20th century. Now, despite the growth I've been talking about, Washington Heights was still very rural and suburban. This is an image from an 1899 Harper's Magazine article which illustrates a residential neighborhood in Washington Heights. Here we can see large houses lining one of the avenues in a very bucolic setting. Numerous newspapers and magazines had articles about Washington Heights during those years, and to each article, all of them predicted that Washington Heights' future was as a residential community, a residential district for the upper middle class, featuring large houses on the avenues interspersed with more modest rows of houses on the numbered side streets. As it happened, that wasn't the case at all. And the reason was a combination of those factors that I mentioned earlier, rapid transit and the rising popularity of the apartment house. Now, before we take a closer look at those two factors, let me talk a little bit about streets and street openings. The development of streets north of 155th Street was slow and it was often tedious. The process continued actually into the first decades of the 20th century. The details are very interesting, but actually, if I went into all of them, it would take much more time than we have together this evening. So let me just give you a couple of bullet points, because housing on a large scale is definitely not possible without a street plan. No one is going to build a house if they think that sometime in the future, the city might take the land and put a street through it and leave them homeless. So among the bullet points about streets, first and foremost, Manhattan's grid, as developed in 1814, ended at 155th Street, which is the southernmost street in today's Washington Heights. And the city was very, very slow to develop any plans for streets north of that point. In the 1860s, a group of commissioners was appointed by the state legislature to lay out the streets and avenues north of that point, 155th Street, all the way to the top of the mountain, at the top of the island, not the mountain. That commission was at work for 5 years, and they had explicit instructions not to use a grid plan because it wasn't suitable for the terrain in northern Manhattan. After 5 years, they had accomplished very little other than commissioning a survey and the map. And you can see part of that map here on the screen. And there is the Jumel Mansion, just to again orient you. You can see the mansion there, and below it, a little bit to the west, you can see a laid out garden plan. Now, after dismissing that 1860 commission, the state legislature gave the mandate for developing streets in northern Manhattan to the Central Park Commission, which was under the direction of Andrew Haswell Green. That group, under Green, was responsible for creating all of the major avenues and cross streets that we use in northern Manhattan today. So now we've gotten past streets, let's take a look at transportation and the role that it played in developing northern Manhattan. Prior to the 20th century, the lack of transportation had restricted northern Manhattan to two groups of people. One, the smaller of the two, comprised the wealthy residents who had personal transportation, such as horses and carriages, that they could use for travel to the city some 9 miles away. The other group, and it was the larger group of residents, worked and lived in the vicinity. The only places they normally went were places they could go on foot. On those rare occasions when they left their individual communities, they used stagecoaches in the early years, and after mid-century, they used either the Hudson River Railroad or steamboat service. The image you have here is of the New Congress Sugar Refinery, which was built by Dennis Harris in the early 1850s. But in it, you can see both of those forms of mass transit. The Jenny Lind there in the foreground was a steamboat that Dennis Harris's brother William operated for several years between Lower Manhattan and Poughkeepsie, with a stop at 158th Street. And there along the shore, you can see the Hudson River Railroad headed north. These commuting opportunities opened Washington Heights, Lower Washington Heights, to developments such as Audubon Park, which I noted on an earlier slide. Even more encouraging to population growth was the 1879 opening of the elevated railroad station at 155th Street. Faster and more frequent than the Hudson River Railroad, the elevated encouraged a new building boom. This one mainly produced row houses for a prosperous but solidly middle class. As you can see on the map at the right, the elevated would have been clearly visible to anyone in the mansion looking southeast, and likely would have been considered a blot on the landscape. But worse was to come with the construction of the viaduct in the late 1880s. This image, which is from an 1890 edition of Scientific American, focuses on that viaduct, which connected the top of the bluff with the Macombs Dam Bridge far below. And you can see that over in the upper left of this image. Below the viaduct, you had the elevated station. It had stairways both up to the viaduct and down to the street level. When the station first opened in 1879, passengers had to walk all the way down multiple flights to the river's level, then cross over to a different set of steps that they took to reach the top of the bluff. The viaduct's opening in 1890 meant that they could go straight up to the level of the viaduct to reach their destinations in Washington Heights. In this image, you can also see Brotherhood Park, which later became known as the Polo Grounds. A polo stadium was completed there in 1876 and then converted to a baseball stadium in 1880, and it was rebuilt in 1890. So the version we're seeing here is most likely that 1890 version of the Polo Grounds. It was further renovated after a fire in 1911. And as many of you probably know, during its lifetime, the stadium was the site for polo, baseball, and football. It was home to the New York Giants, New York Yankees, New York Mets, as well as the New York Giants and New York Jets football teams. Now, the greatest catalyst for growth in northern Manhattan at the turn of the 20th century was, of course, the arrival of the New York subways in the fall of 1904. It had been discussed and anticipated for years, so by the time it arrived, developers had already snapped up most of the most desirable lots along the route and either begun building or would begin building in the next few years. Even holdout owners like the Grinnells and Audubon Park could no longer resist the opportunity to divest themselves of property at those top market prices. This photograph shows Broadway at 157th Street just a few months after the subway opened. This was in May of 1905. You can see the kiosks on either side of the street, which led down to the subways. And you can see the Church of the Intercession. That's its second location at Broadway and 158th Street before it moved down to 155th and Broadway. And to the left, you can see a bit of Audubon Park. If you see that triangular lot, sort of the middle of the left, that's where the Grinnell apartment house, 800 Riverside Drive, sits today. Lots on the eastern side, you can see were already cleared and some excavations were underway for apartment buildings. Before the decade was complete, apartment buildings, shops, and stores would line all of Broadway that we can see in this photo all the way from the bottom to the top. Now, changes in the blocks surrounding the Morris-Jumel Mansion mirrored those that were happening in Washington Heights as a whole, beginning with that double row of wooden houses built on Sylvan Terrace in 1882. You can see those houses here in the lower right of the screen. That is how they look today, restored from how they looked several decades ago, or many decades ago now. Between 1890 and 1902, developers covered the blocks between 160th and 162nd Streets with brick and stone row houses using the Queen Anne, Romanesque Revival, and Classical Revival architectural styles. While these houses dramatically altered the streetscape, they still sat at a distance from the mansion, which was and is on a slightly higher elevation. So in one sense, all of these buildings that were constructed then in those years between 1890 and 1902 function as a rather fine setting for a precious jewel amongst them. Consider also that by the time the subway arrived in 1904, with its attendant building boom, all of those apartment buildings, these lots, if they had not been built up with these row houses, could have been covered with multi-story apartment buildings that would have dwarfed the mansion and left it in near permanent shadow. Now, in 1909, one apartment building did arrive. It was on the corner of Jumel Terrace and West 160th Street. It was likely under construction when this map, this 1909 map, was published. The 16-6-story neo-federal apartment house was designed by architect Thomas Neville, who often worked in association with George Arthur Bagg, Neville and Bagg. In material and style, it blended with its neighbors and was really not that disruptive, both because of the topography. It was lower. That apartment building was lower than the mansion, and it was far away from it. And again, the style complemented the buildings around it, and so it was not too much of a disruption on the established landscape. One interesting bit about these buildings, which later became the Jumel Terrace Historic District in 1970, is that all of them, as far as is known, all of them were the first and the only structures to have existed on these lots. Now, some of you with sharp eyes may have already noted on this map that the mansion is labeled the Museum of Revolutionary Period Historic Relics, focusing more on its connections with George Washington, which it did in the early years, than with the families who had lived there. Mirroring these pivotal changes in the neighborhood around the mansion were changes within as it made its transition from a private home, private residence, to a public museum. So let's backtrack again a little. After Eliza Jumel's death in 1865, the mansion passed through the hands of several families, beginning with a rather contentious court battle among her heirs, who included multiple litigants, all claiming part of her estate. Soon after that case ended, the house was sold, and in 1889, the LePrince family moved in for a few years. Then, 1894 to 1903, General Ferdinand Earle, his wife Lily, and their children lived there and rechristened the estate Earl Cliff. Now, around the time that the Earls moved into the mansion, various groups interested in historical antiquities began floating ideas about preserving it. Those groups became even more vocal after General Earle's death in January 1903. Lily Earle, his widow, was not initially in favor of the plan, but eventually agreed to sell the mansion and about 2 acres of land to New York City, which bought it in 1903 for $235,000. Now, in 2025 dollars, that would be about 7.4 million. Considering the high prices that developers were paying for land in 1903, Lily Earle's decision could well have saved the mansion from demolition. Otherwise, it could have been destroyed and replaced with one or two multi-story apartment buildings. Another key figure in preserving the mansion was Ella Wilson Kramer. You can see her there on the screen. She organized the Washington Headquarters Association, WHA, which comprised 4 Daughters of the American Revolution chapters. That organization was key in preserving the mansion. Ella Kramer Wilson also was the first president of the museum when it opened in 1907. Although the area around it was called Roger Morris Park in honor of its first owner, who, by the way, was a Tory, did leave the United States before the American Revolution, the WHA's initial focus was on the mansion's connection to George Washington and the American Revolution. The other 3 photographs on this slide, other than Ella Wilson Kramer, all date from 1907. That was the year the mansion opened. Of particular interest is the view of the carriage house there on the lower right, which was photographed from the roof of 430 West 162nd Street, which was directly across, or is directly across, Jumel Terrace from the mansion. And I must mention that all of these photographs come from the private collection of Wesley P. Burton, who is a descendant of the folks who took these particular photographs, and on the next slide you'll see are actually in them. He was kind enough to share them and let me share them with you tonight. Now, these 2 photos, which also date from 1907, feature the Ettlinger family, who had recently bought and moved into 430 West 162nd Street, and the Schmidt family, who lived on Sylvan Terrace. Mrs. Ida Ettlinger and Mrs. Catherine Schmidt were sisters. Their father, William Kramer, was the original owner of the Atlantic Gardens music venue in Lower Manhattan and a major property owner in Northern Manhattan. So far, no genealogical information connects this Kramer family with Ella Wilson Kramer, and my initial research suggests that none existed. Their family lines go in completely different directions. The Kramers, Ella Wilson Kramer's family, through her husband, goes back to New England, and the William Kramer, who owned the Atlantic Gardens, was an immigrant from Germany. As you may have noticed on that earlier 1909 map, which was a couple of slides ago, and here it is again, 2 large plots of land remained undeveloped at the first decade of the 20th century. Although the apartment building at 425 West 160th Street does not appear on this map, it was under construction and would soon be completed. The 2 lots that were vacant, however, were the one south of the mansion and the one north of the mansion. So as we come to the end of this presentation, let's look at them chronologically. Between 1914 and 1916, a 12-story apartment building rose on the southern side of the mansion, the largest and tallest building in the immediate vicinity. As was customary at the time, the owners marketed it by giving it a name. And in honor of the adjacent mansion, they called it the Roger Morris Apartments. The architects, Simon I. Schwartz and Arthur Gross, were prolific designers of apartment buildings in northern Manhattan during the subway boom, and they were particularly known for their ability to maximize usage of interior space, thus maximizing the profits for the building owners. As designed, the building is 12 stories tall, except on Edgecombe Avenue, which includes the main entrance to the building. On that side, because of the sloping site, the basement and the cellar are both visible, so the building appears to be 14 stories high on that particular elevation. Most often, Schwartz and Gross use the Beaux-Arts principles in their designs, and we can see those here. Echoing the elements of the classic column with the base, the shaft, and the capital, the Roger Morris apartments sit on a one-story base of granite. Rising above that are multiple stories of beige brick, and it was originally topped with an ornate cornice that you can see here in this photograph, but that was later removed, so you can't see that today. Originally, the Roger Morris included 105 apartments with 479 rooms. One unique feature was that none of the apartments had a maid's room. Now, this was a very common feature in apartment buildings from this period. But instead of a maid's room in the apartments, the architects created 21 small rooms for live-in servants at the penthouse level. Normally, of course, the penthouse level would be the most expensive apartment, but in this case, in the original building, 21 small rooms for live-in servants. The Roger Morris Apartments, or 555 Edgecombe Avenue, as it is better known today, has had a storied history that undoubtedly will be discussed in future parlor chats. For now, let's just view it in terms of its architectural contribution to the cityscape surrounding the mansion. Clearly, as 12 stories tall, it obscures the panoramic view that the mansion once had looking south. And no doubt people in the neighborhood thought it was ungainly when it was new. But after more than a century, it has become as much a part of the streetscape as the mansion, contrasting with it architecturally, culturally, and historically. It actually emphasizes the mansion's significance as the oldest house in New York City. So now let's look at the other lot. The six-story Jumel Hall at 421 West 162nd Street was much less disruptive to the established streetscape when it was built in the late 1920s than the Roger Morris apartments had been when they were built a decade earlier. Its 6 stories are only slightly higher than the adjacent row houses, and due to the natural topography and the grade of West 162nd Street, it sits lower than the mansion, so it's much less visible than the Roger Morris Apartments, 555 Edgecombe. By the early 1920s, taste and needs had changed among the people who were living in apartments in northern Manhattan, and architects began adapting those designs accordingly. Apartments, for example, had fewer rooms, and the designs focused more on convenience than on replicating the amenities of single-family homes. Jumel Hall has a much simpler facade, as you can see, than the Beaux-Arts design of Roger Morris apartments, and it employed less expensive materials. Even so, it maintains some of that tripartite design with a brick belt course separating the first floor from the floors above. And then there at the top story, you can see that ornate brick pattern creates the effect of a cornice there at the top floor. So we've come to the end of our journey through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. We've had a look at the changes taking place around the mansion, a little bit in it, and we trace the development of the streetscape that surrounds the mansion today. So now let's pause and I'll take any questions that the audience might have.
Alrighty, amazing. Thank you for that, Matthew. And I see we already have some questions loaded up. So the first one is, when was the carriage house removed? It does not seem to appear in the 1923 photo showing the 12-story apartment, Roger Morris apartment building.
Let's go back to that map. And sorry, what was the question again?
When was the carriage house removed?
Ah, that I don't really know. And maybe you do, being there at the mansion and having experienced its history and studied its history.
I do not have an answer on that one. I think maybe if I were to look into it, I would go to the map of 162nd Street, which is the one that what you were saying.
The
Uh,
one from 1909, and it is definitely not there in 1909.
so I think by 1909, it's definitely gone. But then that photo was from
1907, which
1907.
suggests,
Okay.
right, right. So it suggests it was during that period.
Mhm.
Good sleuthing there. It suggests it was during that period. Do bear in mind that sometimes the city maps, this is a Sanborn city map, sometimes do not include everything that was there.
Mhm.
Although I can't think of any reason that they would have omitted the carriage house if it was still there. It would be much more likely, for example, with the apartment building that was under construction, that wouldn't be there. But
That makes
something that was established as the carriage house, you would think they would have added. So, yes, we could probably say between 1907, when the Ettlingers took that picture from their rooftop, and 1909.
it's a pretty narrow window. So yeah, I second that. That's awesome. So another question that we have is today there is a perceived east/west divide in Washington Heights, with Broadway being the dividing line. Has your research uncovered anything to support a difference in the development patterns or the intended quote unquote marketing for development east and west of Broadway?
That's a really great question, and I would refer anyone who's interested in that to Robert Snyder's superb book, and the title just went out of my head, um, about that East-West divide. It was clearly evident back in the 1840s and 50s when you had working class Carmen'sville on and let's see if we can go back to a map here. Sorry for the tediousness of my moving backwards, but I think with a map it would help.
No worries.
And I'm really bad at talking and moving slides. So down there towards the south, you see if there's Carmen'sville, which was over here, and Audubon Park over here. Carmen'sville was very much a working class village, and Audubon Park was very much an upper middle class suburban enclave. Interestingly enough, though, as building began in the 1893, most of it was along St. Nicholas Avenue, and there were quite a few really luxurious homes built all the way down below 155th Street. Of course, you have things like the Bailey Mansion, for example. So you had those. However, there was a perceived difference even into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s when apartment buildings were built between the apartments on the east side of Broadway and those on the west side of Broadway. So, yes, my research over the years of studying the Audubon Park neighborhood and lower Washington Heights does support that idea that there was more of an idea of a little bit more expensive on the western side of Broadway than on the east.
Wonderful. So the next question, this is kind of a two-parter slash two different questions. Do you know of any other buildings that you found in your research that were part of the Jumel estate? And then the second question is, do you know the biggest estate or property owner nearest the mansion during this time period?
Oh, right. Let's go back to the first question. Actually, I don't know of any other buildings, but in our pre-game warm-up, Danielle, you mentioned something to me. Would you talk about that while I move the map?
Yes, I don't mind if I do. I've been nerding out over this. So, we had a visiting historian from one of the other historic houses that we have a connection with through the Phillips family, Phillips Manor Hall. And he is writing a totally unrelated to the Phillips book about the Croton Aqueduct, and he came to do some research in our archives to see what we had about Eliza and the sale of her land for the purpose of the Croton Aqueduct. And so in that, he showed me a map that he had gotten that was when they were looking to build the aqueduct, they were surveying all the property that they would be going through. And on the Jumel estate, there was actually a farmer named Thomas Musgrove, and I believe that there was another one, but that doesn't so much relate to this particular instance, who Thomas Musgrove rented the land at about 167th Street. Based on our calculations. And so Keith, who was the visiting historian, he went from our meeting and walked over to 167th Street and tried to kind of trace where this creek that we had found in the map that he showed me was, and if there were any remains of it. And so in that, he found not only the remains of the creek, but also the remains of the farmhouse, which we can assume to be Musgrove's farmhouse due to the location, and then also a farm road probably built by Thomas Musgrove and also possibly traveled by Eliza Jumel or folks who were working the estate at that time. So that's kind of a new building on the estate that we have sort of right now in the forefront. But of course, there were other things that we know from either listings like barns and areas for hays and hay to be stored and ice houses and smoke houses and things like that, that I think also now with sort of this positive, you know, finding with the Musgrove farm and the creek, perhaps, you know, there's opportunity to take a look at some older maps and go into Highbridge Park and see what sort of remains lie there. But yeah, now I'll turn it over to you.
That's great. And one other building that was most likely there was a house for storing ashes,
Mm-hmm.
because ashes were key in making soap, and most houses had some way to store them. I have studied a couple of maps. One is the series of maps, farm maps that John Randall made at the time that he did the survey for the grid plan. And he did these really detailed drawings of things. And for the Moncel estate, which lay directly south of the Jumels, he had drawn a little house which was where they kept their ashes for making soap. So they likely had one on the Jumel Mansion as well. And you probably could go to that map. There used to be an online version of it, which was in conjunction with the 2014 exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York on the grid, and they had a version that you could enlarge. And you could probably go to the Jumel estate and see other buildings that Randall had drawn on that particular map. For the other part of that question about I think it was who were the nearby large landholders. This is the map from 1865. I know it's not huge on most of your screens, so I'll move my cursor around. I hope you can see it. Here's the Jumel estate over here. One of their largest neighbors was the Deaf and Dumb Asylum. That was the name of it. And that was there. It had been built, I believe it was in the early 1850s. Prior to that, this had been Fanwood, which was the estate of James Monroe, who was a lineal descendant of the president, James Monroe, I think, and through his James Monroe's brother. That had been his estate. A name that you will see here a lot is Shepherd Knapp. He owned quite a bit of property down here. This is Audubon Park. He owned property down around it and property up here north of the Jumels. The Jumel estate also had some land up here, as well as I remember from maps. This is the Institute for the Blind, which was next to this one. There were several institutes on Washington Heights in the mid and later 19th century. The reason being that the air was considered fresher, it was a healthier environment, and so that's where they built these. Plus, the land was there were larger plots, and it was cheaper, and so they could afford to buy it. Oh, here's more of Shepherd Knapp's land right here. So those were the main property owners. Of course, in Audubon Park at this time, George Blake Grinnell had been buying up property and houses as they were available, so he was the main owner there. Earlier in the 1850s, Dennis Harris, who I mentioned earlier, built this sugar refinery over here. He owned all of this land in here. He had financial problems. He sold off part of it, he lost part of it. And of course, down here was where Richard Carman owned a large amount of land and where he developed Carmansville.
Wonderful. So the next question that we have is, when the mansion became a museum focused on George Washington, some of the extensions and additions were removed. Do you have an opinion on whether additions should remain in place as part of the history of the mansion or should be removed to return it to a particular point in history? And I think you even have a photograph of exactly sort of the area of the house that this is talking about, with a kitchen that was later added on to the mansion and then taken off in some of our first years as a museum. So if you go to the next one,
next one?
Yes, the one with 555, at least I remember.
Oh, sorry. Let me go back. I see where
it was totally not the next one, and that that was my
oh, right here.
Yes, my misdirection. But yes.
And maybe the next one shows.
Yes, there we go. That's a better one.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
and do I have an opinion whether it should be returned, left?
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, in 1923, it's still there. But as we know today, it's been removed to what is believed to be the original state. But it would still be 100-year-old kitchen, possibly even older, if we even just thought of it as being a 1923 edition. So not knowing the particular date on it, what is your take on this?
Right. This reminds me of something that my engineer brother said to me once when we were working on our apartment. And I said, I was trying to figure out what to do in the bathroom because we had tile from 3 different periods. And he said, well, after a while, they've blended together so much that you have a little bit that's original, but you have other that's been there almost as long. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hedging a little bit here because I can argue both ways. One is that this, for X number of years, was an important part of the mansion. So it's part of its history. And so considering that, yes, wouldn't you want to keep it or reconstruct it? On the other hand, if you're trying to create the mansion as it was at a specific date or specific period, and that didn't fit, then you would take it off. I'm also reminded of a tour that my spouse Scott Robinson and I took of a mansion on the Hudson some years ago, and they had interpreters that day, and we were in a room, and the interpreter was telling us quite a bit about the room. And she was from the Revolutionary War period. And she was telling us all about the room. And at one point, someone said, well, can you describe what the room was like when you were here? And she said, we would have been outside because the room didn't exist during her period. So again, it's the idea of creating a space that is faithful to a particular period. If there was something that were really an accretion that somehow didn't fit, you could clearly make a case for removing it. Something like this, I think you can go both ways.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that's something that we kind of think about all the time just as a staff too, thinking about the Earl kitchen, or sort of the precursor to what we now have as the modern kitchen off the basement, that follows the blueprint of the house, footprint of the house directly. But these pictures are always so interesting because you see also the little chimney where perhaps a gas stove or a coal burning stove would have been to sort of modernize the cooking process. And so it's always been something that is interesting. It's also part of the reason why we have a door that leads to nowhere in
Right.
one part of the house, which is really interesting. And a lot of people have some questions about it.
Right.
Um, so we're getting a lot of thank yous for your talk in the chat. We have some info on the book. Snyder's book is Crossing Broadway,
Thank you very
by
much.
Robert
Crossing
Snyder.
Broadway.
If anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat because we have a few more minutes left. And then this question is, did Roger Morris Park become a public park at around the same time as the mansion became a public museum? In your research and the maps, have you come across anything like that?
Again, I cannot say for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but if we look at, whoops, let's go back. If we look at these two images from 1907,
Mm-hmm.
with these two families, the Ettlingers and the Schmidts, it looks like they're really just sort of helping themselves to enjoy themselves at the mansion. So I would say it must have been, particularly for and you know they if you notice there on the balcony, part of the family is up on the balcony, so they had gone through the house to get up there. So
Yeah.
yes, I think it must have been open to the public at that time.
Yes. And I agree. As far as I'm aware of, when the city purchased the house, they also purchased the land for park use. And so it seems at this point, 1906, 1907, it was definitely free for the usage of all the neighbors already. So we can assume that maybe in years prior they were also using it as parkland as well.
But they did put on their best clothes to go over.
They did, which I find really lovely. Because especially, I mean, especially we still do the connections between back then and today are really great because there's still always, especially in springtime, little kids who come to do their springtime photo shoots with their families. So it makes me smile just seeing it day to day and seeing back then too. Which is the history nerd in me, I say fondly of myself. But so anybody else have any last minute questions? I'll give about a minute or so for anyone to add something in. Oh, this is a very good one. Can you talk about the impetus to retain US history with a historic house like the Morris-Jumel Mansion? Why is something like the Morris-Jumel Mansion important to US history as a whole? And I think what's really interesting is we have the 250th anniversary of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence coming up. And so even more timely for this question.
Yes. Got 3 minutes for a 3 hour answer. Uh, no,
Talk really fast.
no, just generally, I think any uh, house like this is important, particularly now that the staff, the people who are running museums like this and in other museums around the country, are doing their best to tell the entire story. For a long time, the story was told really from the perspective of the owners and of the wealthier class, because most of what was preserved was were the homes of the wealthier. But I think when you take a place like the Morris-Jumel Mansion, which besides being used as a home, at one point was Washington's headquarters for important battles in the Revolutionary War, and then later was used for a roadhouse. You know, you've got this really rich story that you can tell and connect to not only the history of the neighborhood, but the history of New York and the history of the country. So I think for all those reasons, places like this, structures like this, are really worth keeping and worth interpreting and reinterpreting. Because I know, for example, and I've got 1 minute left, I grew up near Williamsburg, Virginia, And when we used to visit back in the 1950s and 60s and really enjoy it, the stories they were telling then, all of the guides, the hostesses had on what was the equivalent of a ball gown, and all of the furniture was in satins and silks. Later, as it became more obvious and as more research was done, they began to change and make it much more like it was originally, not just a sort of pageant. And I think, again, that's really, really important, particularly when you're using interpreters who are trying to put you in the era, in the place of the events that were happening to help you feel a part of it to understand history better.
All right. And hey, you hit 8 o'clock exactly. You got that 3 hour answer into just 3 minutes. That was very impressive. Well,
Good, good.
thank you, Matthew. This has been very wonderful. I appreciate you being here with us and with our audience so very much, and taking the time to enlighten us about some really fascinating stuff on this Wednesday evening. Um,
Thanks very much. And thanks to all the audience for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. If you're interested, we do a virtual program this year under the Connect260 name every third Wednesday of the month. So tune back in then. It was a pleasure having you all. It was a pleasure having you, Matthew. And have a great night, folks.